The new developments in the Karen Reed murder trial.
This has been a wild turn of events.
I've seen a lot of things. I've never seen anything like this. This case never ceases to amaze me.
It's a spectacle, that's for sure.
It was a hung jury, so no verdict, no real ending to this case.
Karen Reed was back in court where a date was set for her to be tried once again.
There are a lot of issues in this case.
Proctor was improperly searching Karen Reed's cell phone for nude photos.
Michael Proctor, the lead investigator,
relieved of his duties.
It's always the theories that each side will put forth for a jury to decide which one is more believable.
Karen Reed was drunk and angry and hit and killed John O'Keefe when she gunned it in the snowstorm.
Karen, did you ever say I hit him?
I did not.
There are more people here at the beginning of this than at the beginning of Johnny Depp's trial.
We're not concerned about any of the witnesses. None of the Commonwealth's witnesses are concerning us.
and once again, there was drama outside court.
There is a whole new set of legal troubles for Karen Reed. She is now facing a wrongful death lawsuit.
The lawsuit alleges that Karen Reed was drunk and reckless when she hit John O'Keefe.
It's not just Reed being sued here. The family also suing the two Canton bars from that night.
The two bars are liable for over-serving her.
The FBI is investigating an investigation of a murder. That never, ever happens.
At this point, multiple jurors have been reaching out to both sides, saying that they are certain Karen Reed is not a killer.
I did not kill John O'Keefe. I've never harmed a hair on John O'Keefe's head.
We're looking at arm injuries with scratches. We're not looking at tire tracks.
There are 17 jurors, and they are coming and going with a police escort.
The investigation wasn't thorough.
This can't be good for the prosecution moving forward.
I just hope justice is served for either one, whatever it is, you know.
The fate of her life is not in her hands anymore. It's not in the hands of her attorneys. It's not in the hands of the prosecutor. It's in the hands of the jury now.
The second murder trial of Karen Reed for the death of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, is officially underway. And it didn't take long to realize that this one is going to be much different than the first trial. While I want to be able to focus on just what's being presented as evidence in this trial, it's impossible not to compare every detail, every strategy, every timeline or statement with all of the ones that I've been dissecting and analyzing over the last year or so. Each morning, the same tiny courtroom in Dedham, Massachusetts fills with all the familiar faces, plus a few new ones, and a feeling of deja vu creeps in. A glitchy double take of an anxious April morning that I feel like I've already gone through before. But on day one, as prosecutor Hank Brennan begins delivering his opening statements, it only takes a single moment for the illusion to break, and it becomes glaringly obvious that the second trial of Karen Reed will look nothing like the first. Part of that is simply having a different prosecutor, but more importantly is that with that different prosecutor comes an all-new strategy and a totally opposite style of litigation. Brennan's theatrical storyteller's approach is in stark contrast to Adam Lally's monotone clinical delivery. And while Lally used his time for openings to basically just stand at the podium and go down the witness list while the jurors probably zoned out, Brennan paced back and forth in front of the jury box, trying to engage the jurors by painting a picture of what he says happened in the early morning hours when Officer John O'Keefe tragically lost his life.
At 6:04 a.m. on January 29, 2022, the alarm bell sounded in the Canton Fire Department. Firefighter paramedic Timothy Nuttall knew what that meant. His heart skipped a beat, he raced to his equipment, and he picked up his bag, which was meticulous. There was a sign and a signal, and then there was a voice commanding that there was cardiac arrest. The most serious of calls for a firefighter and paramedic, that means that a person's heart has stopped.
Brennan walks through a story of Canton firefighters Nuttall and Flamati driving to the call in blizzard conditions and then trying to calm themselves and think about their next steps and the task ahead. He says that when the ambulance arrived, he opened the back doors, cold air hit him on the face, and he could hear a woman screaming. As he headed toward those screams in the darkness, he approached three women surrounding a man lying on the ground. And when they began CPR, he looked up at Miss Reed and asked her this.
He said, "What happened?" and you'll hear her words through firefighter Nuttall. She said, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." And it was at that time, with the words of the defendant, that she admitted what she had done that night, that she hit John O'Keefe.
Okay, and here is where I can no longer be a part of an engaged audience listening to a tragic story, and instead I'm once again listening with my analytical mind. And my first thought is, wait, did he just tell the jury that they will hear Karen's words? I hit him, I hit him, I hit him? Because since when is there video of that? Maybe he said they will hear those words through firefighter Nuttall instead of to him? And also, saying that it was at that time that Karen Read admitted what she had done still kind of loses me, because if you're confessing to murder at the scene of your dead boyfriend, they don't just send you home and talk to you later. That's why this whole confession thing has never really gained any traction with me, because it's just not logical. Now, remember how I said I can't help but compare every detail and all of the information that I already know about this case? Yeah, this is what I mean by that. But the next part is even worse.
Now, those words didn't mean anything to firefighter Nuttall. They weren't in context. They didn't reconcile with the injuries. They didn't help him in his treatment, so he ignored it. Now, firefighter Nuttall is not a police officer. He's a first responder. And so he takes that information. It was useless to him. He continues to work on John O'Keefe, trying to save his life.
So the prosecutor is telling the jury right now that the defendant that he's prosecuting just confessed at the murder scene, but the first responder was like, "Nah, I'm not a cop. That doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't help with my treatment of this guy, and it doesn't look like that makes sense with these injuries, so I'm just going to ignore that." I'm sorry, what? That information is useless to him? It was at this moment that I kind of wished for Lally to be back at the podium, reading off the witness list while me and the jurors were once again just kind of zoning out. An opening statement that comes across more like a roll call of the witness list? I mean, I can at least respect that. But this? Not so much. Useless? I just can't wrap my head around that. Brennan tells the jury that they are here today because John O'Keefe was killed by the actions and conduct of the defendant, Karen Read. He then lays out some details for them, including his theory of what happened, along with some new data information that he says will be introduced, explaining the facts, science, and data will all be on his side, supporting his theory. So, what is this updated theory with the new data and new experts? Brennan says that Karen and John's relationship had started deteriorating, leading to tension between them, including an argument where he had asked Karen to leave and she wouldn't. He describes their night out together, telling the jury that Karen had 8 vodka drinks in the 2 hours that she was out, before the couple left to head toward the Alberts house around midnight. Now, Brennan says the location data on John's phone was from the Waze app, and he says that that will show exactly where John was, and he calls this the strongest and most accurate location data that you can have. He also mentions healthcare data, which I'm assuming refers to the Apple Health data, and he explains it shows movements as well, and that it shows it as steps, but that the steps aren't really steps sometimes. Now, it's worth noting that he takes the time to tell the jury here which cell phone data is reliable and which he says isn't. And it's no surprise that the one that he says is the most reliable is the one that supports his theory, and the one that he says is not reliable is the one that supports the defense. We'll be right back after this. Now, Brennan also brings up the cell phone battery temperature of John O'Keefe, which this is new data that we didn't have before. And he gives the temperature of the cell phone at multiple times during the story of what he says happened, telling the jury that this information will be critical in their analysis of the case. Now, Brennan said that Karen and John stayed at McCarthy's until about 9:45, and that's incorrect. They actually are seen leaving McCarthy's at 10:40, and he says that they arrive at Waterfall around 10 o'clock. But It was actually almost 11. But regardless, he says it was a happy celebratory mood, and they left Waterfall at 12:12 a.m. That one's at least close. Now, on the way there, Brennan says that Karen listens to a call between John and Jen McCabe, where Jen is giving directions and uses Bella's mom's house as a reference point, a woman that John briefly dated years before. Now, they get lost, they pass the road, and have to do a 3-point turn, which Brennan says triggers the black box in the car and records what's going on. And then they go back toward Fairview. Now, Brennan says at 12:23, there's a truck coming in the other direction. This would be Ryan Nagel coming to get his sister Julie from the house. And the truck blinks the lights at the SUV that is now facing them, letting Karen turn right onto the road in front of them, and then they make a left-hand turn and follow the SUV to 34 Fairview. Now, Hank's timeline gets a little wonky here, and by wonky, I mean he should have used notes because it doesn't make any sense. He says that the SUV pulled up to the flagpole in front of the Alberts at 12:34:33. He says that the truck is there for 5 minutes and leaves, and then 2 minutes later is the collision. Now, I think that maybe he meant 12:24 and not 12:34, so whatever. We'll just assume it and go with that. Now, Brennan says that John got out of Karen's car and stood by the side of the road after an argument with her. He says that anger, fueled by heavy intoxication, caused Karen to drive at least 35 feet away. She stopped, put the car in neutral, then put it in reverse and pressed the gas. He says it was up to 75% acceleration, and the Lexus tire spun backwards as she went at least 70 feet, then clipped John O'Keefe, causing him to fall backwards and hit his head, which broke his skull, and he lied on the ground on top of his cell phone, not looking mortally wounded, so Karen drove away. Now, all of this had to have happened within 20 seconds. Brennan says at 12:31 and 56 seconds, John starts to move according to his phone data. He checks his phone, he has a text from Jen McCabe, that's at 12:32:09, and then he falls 7 seconds later after being hit at 12:32 and 16 seconds. Now, I'm not sure how John's phone disconnected from the Bluetooth at 12:30 if he didn't get out of the car until 12:32, and I'm also not sure how or why he stood in the road for 20 seconds in the snow while Karen drove forward and then put it in neutral and then reversed into him. But I assume that Brennan will try to clear that up somehow during trial because I think it needs to be clearer. Now, Brennan says that the temperature of John's phone began to drop after he exited the car, and he brings up the angry voicemails that Karen left for John after she drove away and went to his house. He describes waking up the next morning, frantic, calling Kerry Roberts and Jen McCabe, and the hectic scene that we've all heard about going to find him in the early morning hours. Then we hear something new. Brennan tells the jury that they will hear from Peggy O'Keefe, John's mother, about an interaction that she had in the hospital with Karen. Mrs. O'Keefe wasn't on the witness list before. She was added later, and I'm pretty sure I know why. More on that later because it's something I'm really upset about, and you'll hear that in my tone. Now, Brennan mentions the hair on John's bumper and his DNA on the taillight area of Karen's SUV, and tells the jury that a medical expert will testify that John's head injury came from hitting the ground. Now, he describes the 3 indictments against Karen and tells the jury that this isn't a trial where they have to determine if Karen Reed intentionally killed John O'Keefe. The charges, he says, are basically written in a way that the only thing that they really have to prove is that she intentionally drove back toward him. And doing that is something that could likely cause his death. And as he begins to wrap it up, Brennan shows a short media clip from an interview that Karen did for Dateline that aired in October of last year.
I mean, I didn't think I hit him, but could I have clipped him? Could I have tagged him in the knee and incapacitated him? He didn't look mortally wounded as far as I could see, but could I have done something that knocked him out and in drunkenness and in the cold didn't come to again?
And this would have been the moment you dropped him off at the party.
Yeah, would have had to.
Brennan then tells the jury to follow the evidence that he says will lead them to the truth, which he says is this: that on January 29th, 2022, Karen was very intoxicated and had argued with John about their relationship. And after the fight was over, she left, but then brought the fight back to him in the form of her SUV. He says she clipped him, he fell backwards and broke his head. Then she left him in that yard with no help, and he says that the defendant's own words will confirm everything that they've already concluded. I am curious to hear more about this new theory and how they think this happened now. You know, I looked at my old records and my old notes and all of the graphics that I made about the Commonwealth's theory before. And it's interesting because it's changed. So according to the Commonwealth before, they said that the phone stopped between 34 and 32 Fairview Road in the area of the flagpole and the fire hydrant at 122440. So he says 1234 in the openings, but I'm just going to assume that he meant 1224. We're just going to assume, to make things easier, that he went with that. Now, the final plotted point was at 1225 when the phone stopped showing any movement. And in the old theory, they said that John got out of the car and then Karen drove at least 62 feet forward. Now they're saying she only drove 35 feet forward. In the old theory, they said that he then reversed 62 feet at 24.2 miles per hour. Now we've dropped the 24.2 miles per hour, at least for now, and now instead of reversing 62 feet, she reversed 75 feet. So she went up 62 and back 62 before, but now she went up 35 and back 75. And before, all of that had to be done within 56 seconds, but now all of that had to be done within 20 seconds. So I don't know. I'm curious to see how they can make this information make a little bit more sense. While there were a few new things that the prosecution introduced in their opening statements, there was also one big thing that they tried to ignore. And when attorney Alan Jackson got up to deliver the openings for the defense, he wasted no time bringing it up himself. We'll be right back after this. This message is sponsored by Greenlight. I want to know who taught you about money. Was it your parents or did you learn it at school? Because let's be honest, most of us learned about saving and budgeting money way later than we should have. But there's good news. You can give your kids a head start with Greenlight. Greenlight is a debit card and money app that's made for families, and it lets kids learn how to save, how to invest, and how to spend money wisely. Parents can send money to their kids and keep an eye on kids' spending and saving. Meanwhile, kids and teens build money confidence and skills in a fun, accessible way, like with games. The Greenlight app also includes a chores feature where you can set up one-time or recurring chores. You can customize them to your own household, and you get to reward kids with allowance for a job well done. How many times have you told yourself this is something that you want to make a change, you want to do better? And why wait? Now is the time. This is the perfect time to try Greenlight for your family and your kids. Greenlight is the easy, convenient way for parents to raise financially smart kids and for families to navigate life together. Maybe that's why millions of parents and kids are learning about money on Greenlight already. Start your risk-free Greenlight trial today at greenlight.com/brandy. That's greenlight.com/brandy to get started. greenlight.com/brandy. There are two ways that attorneys often handle major issues with their case. One way is to acknowledge from the start. Let the jury know that, yes, this is an issue, but here's why this issue isn't so important, or why, yes, there's this issue, but it shouldn't change your conclusion or the outcome of this trial. Now that's one way. The other way is what Brennan did, just pretending like it didn't exist. That's exactly what he did when it came to addressing Michael Proctor, and this left a huge opening for the defense to be the ones to bring it up. an opening that Jackson couldn't wait to take advantage of. Because think about it, this is the lead investigator who was fired because of his conduct in this case. This case. That's huge. And the prosecution didn't tell the jury that? As a juror, once I heard that, I think I would have to wonder what else the prosecutor didn't tell me. And it would put a suspicious fog over the entire situation. So, Jackson gets up and he makes what will be his main argument.
The evidence in this case will establish above everything else 3 points. There was no collision with John O'Keefe. There was no collision. There was no collision. John O'Keefe did not die from being hit by a vehicle. Period. The facts will show that. The evidence will show that. The data will show that. The science will show that. And the experts will tell you that.
I think that opening up their entire case this way was a really smart move. We've all been over the evidence that contradicts the injuries that John suffered being consistent with being hit by a car. And we've all heard the evidence that contradicts the damage to the car being caused by hitting John O'Keefe. And I think it's a really smart move to let the jury know that there's something else that happened. And it wasn't being hit by a car. And they'll hear all about that as the trial goes on. So Jackson says, how did we get here? How is Karen Read on trial for something that never happened? And that's when he introduces the Proctor factor.
So how did we end up here? How does Karen Read end up sitting in that chair on trial for an event that literally never happened? Well, the evidence is going to explain it. And it can be summed up in the following text message at the very beginning of this investigation. A text message of a now fired Massachusetts State Police officer named Michael Proctor. He was the lead investigator on this case, and he was talking about a fellow officer, a fellow cop, who owned the property where John O'Keefe's body was found. Text message with a buddy. Question, is the homeowner going to catch any shit? Answer, nope. He's a Boston cop too. That quote defines the lack of integrity of the Commonwealth's entire case, its entire investigation, and this prosecution.
Jackson references this text exchange between Proctor and his friends later in the openings, telling the jury that by saying Brian Albert won't catch any shit because he's a Boston cop too, he's basically just saying the quiet part out loud. Jackson also explains that this investigation was riddled with errors from the beginning. There was a rush to judgment, followed by incompetence, corruption, and deceit. Then, finally, a deliberate effort to avoid and to cover up the very truth that the jury is there to seek. Jackson lists out the issues with the investigation, including all the things that Proctor should have done and didn't. And he tells the jury that the Commonwealth won't be able to answer to or explain their way out of the reasonable doubt in this case, or the conduct from these troopers. He says this case carries a malignancy, one that has spread through the investigation and through the prosecution from the very start. A cancer that cannot be cut out. And that cancer has a name, Michael Proctor.
Now, you didn't hear his name in the prosecution's opening statement. Not once. And I suspect that was probably by design. But make no mistake about it. The evidence will show in this case that Michael Proctor is the very definition of the Commonwealth's case. And he's also their Achilles heel. There's not a single part of this case, folks, not a single part that he didn't touch, that he didn't direct, that he didn't orchestrate personally. Every single bit of it has his fingerprints on it. You'll learn that Michael Proctor was a longtime family friend of the Alberts. And he's been disgraced by his own agency, not by us, by the Massachusetts State Police. Investigated, suspended, and fired. The evidence will show that Massachusetts State Police found him guilty, found Michael Proctor guilty of bringing dishonor to the department for his conduct, not in some other case, not in some tangential case, in this case, the investigation of Karen Reed. Conduct that included bias in favor of his friends, the all-powerful Albert family, and bias against my client, Miss Reed, the outsider. Do you have any idea how hard it is for a state trooper to get fired? Well, the evidence is going to show that Michael Proctor earned it. Every bit of it.
Jackson begins to move through some of the other evidence and what they intend on introducing. He says the video footage at Waterfall will show a very different picture of Higgins. He's presumably referencing the clip that looks like Higgins is calling John O'Keefe over, and his body language can be interpreted as aggressive, although the prosecution interpreted that body language differently in the last trial. Now, he says that Higgins had a romantic interest in Karen, but she ghosted him, and then ran into him that night when she was out with John. He references Higgins going to Canton PD so late when it was snowing, and he talks about the Alberts, referencing the power and connections that they have in the community, and the ties that they have to law enforcement and first responders in this case. Of course, the butt dials come up and getting rid of their phones, and then Jackson brings up something that piqued my interest.
And the evidence will establish that John got out of the SUV and went into the house. Let me say that again. The facts unequivocally, the data, the science, the witnesses will all unequivocally establish that John O'Keefe went into the Albert home that night. Eyewitnesses and forensic data will establish that fact.
We've heard the data that the defense has introduced to support the theory that John went in the house. For example, the Apple Health data that shows him ascending and descending the stairs. But Jackson says that there's unequivocal forensic data and eyewitness data. And this caught my attention. Now, is this eyewitness Karen Reed, or is it Brian Higgins, who said that there was a tall, dark-haired man who came in that he never named? Or could there be another witness that we haven't heard from yet? I'll be perched with open ears to hear what this is all about. Now, Jackson goes through the timeline of John going in the house and Karen getting increasingly more irritated when he didn't come back out to the car or answer her calls or texts when she called him after she left. And then he mentions something else that's brand new this time around. Jackson references the new pathologist that they have added to the list of experts this time. One who will testify that, despite what we've heard before, John O'Keefe did not suffer from hypothermia, that the evidence will show that he had no cold-induced injuries to his organs and no frostbite, which means he was injured somewhere else, somewhere warmer, and then moved into the cold. Jackson says that this is also supported by the fact that he did not have a single injury consistent with having been hit by a car, not even a bruise, despite being slammed into by a 6,000-pound SUV. He repeats again, there was no collision. Now, Jackson introduces the jury to the dog bite and scratch evidence and references Chloe being rehomed. And he says that the new medical expert will also testify that the injury to the back of John's head couldn't have come from hitting his head on a flat surface like the ground, and that the head injury immediately incapacitated John, which Jackson says further supports their theory of John being moved after the fact. He mentions Proctor lying in a report about there not being any snowplows plowing Fairview that night, and tells the jury that it was their own defense investigator who actually tracked down the snowplow driver. The Google search at 227 was introduced, and the issue with the searches not turning up any pieces of taillight until after Proctor had access to Karen's car. Jackson also clarifies that the video clip that Brennan showed in the openings was Karen referencing the injuries that she saw John with when she found him, as she was frantic and wondering, could I have hit him? He says it was out of context. Now, Brennan brought up John's DNA being on the taillight during openings as well, and Jackson clarifies that the jury wasn't told the whole truth. There were actually 3 DNA profiles on there. There was John's, and then 2 other unknown males. Plus, there were 5 DNA profiles on John's shoes, which he says could support the theory of him being moved after he was injured. Now, in one of the strongest arguments, Jackson points out that the Commonwealth's own medical examiner, Dr. Scorti Bello, did the autopsy and was presented with the prosecution's theory and evidence. And even she refused to conclude that John's death was a homicide, which clearly says a lot about their case. In the end, Jackson said this was all about loyalty, not truth, and there's no way that the Commonwealth will be able to prove every element of this case beyond a moral certainty. So, with both sides laying out their version of what the evidence will show, letting the jurors know what to expect, it's now time for the state to begin presenting their case. And their first witness is the firefighter that Brennan mentioned at the very beginning of his opening statements, Canton Fire Department's Timothy Nuttall. We'll be right back after this. Now, before we move into the testimony portion of what we heard this week, I want to point out a few main themes that I noticed. The lineup of the witnesses being called is very different this time around than it was in the first trial. And there's also a very different approach to how Brennan is presenting the prosecution's case. I think that Brennan is wanting to make the jury dislike Karen, since it's easier to convict someone you don't like. There are a few reasons that I think this, and I'll explain as we go. And while I don't think that this is an ethical strategy, I think that it could be an effective one based on juror interviews in other cases that I've heard before. Once a juror dislikes a defendant, they will often look at everything with a fog of distrust, and that can sometimes overshadow their ability to objectively weigh the evidence and decide if there's enough to prove guilt. Now, as far as themes go when it comes to the defense's strategy, that one has been clear. They have used prior statements and testimony during cross-examination to show the jury how some of these witnesses' stories have evolved and changed over time. Canton Fire Department's Timothy Nuttall is the first example of that. Now, I want to be clear here. I think that being a firefighter and paramedic is such an honorable and admirable profession. Going into these scenes and having the pressure of not knowing what you're walking into and the stress that would come with being responsible for saving lives, it's a high-stakes career, and I applaud anyone who is willing and tough enough to handle it. I think it's important to remember that the focus of these individuals is to get on scene and save lives. And memory can often become unreliable in high-pressure situations like that. And memory can also evolve over time as you talk about situations with others and relive the moments of that day. And sometimes others' recollections or version of what happened can influence your own. And I want to say this before we get into this testimony because I want to give the witnesses the benefit of doubt. Their stories may have changed because of memory being complex and unreliable, not because of someone intentionally being deceitful. So, with that disclaimer, let's talk about Timothy Nuttall's testimony. Brennan leads Nuttall through a line of questioning to recount the events of that morning when he responded to the scene at 34 Fairview. Canton PD had already arrived, but Nuttall and two other firefighter paramedics were the first to arrive in an ambulance. Now, he described John O'Keefe as being cold to the touch with no signs of life and described his injuries. But they decided that it was a workable situation and they would attempt life-saving measures, which they then began. They did CPR, chest compressions, put John O'Keefe on a stretcher, and got him into the ambulance, working on him until they got him to the hospital and turned over his care to the nurses and doctors there. He described the scene and the chaos that kind of ensued around him. Karen Reed was hysterical and screaming. She had blood on her face and her neck, and he gave details about all of that. So here's where the testimony of this witness came under scrutiny here. Nuttall says that he has a very distinct and clear memory of kneeling down at Officer O'Keefe's head as Tony Flamati is doing chest compressions, and he asked Karen Reed if she knows him.
When you looked up and saw that person and asked about any background, what did she say to you?
I hit him.
How clearly do you remember her words saying to you, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him?
I remember it very distinctly.
Dashcam video is played by Brennan. The video is difficult to see because of the snow and water on the windshield, and it's dark outside. But we're able to make out some of what's happening along with the description as they pause the video and discuss it. So in the video, we see the moment when Nuttall is talking to Karen, Kerry, and Jen. And then Flamati, who is over to the side where John was, calls him back and says that they are going to work on John and try life-saving measures. So we can see that Nuttall walks back over to assist. You can hear Karen screaming, and she's running back and forth in the video. And then she runs over to where Nuttall and Flamati are working on John. Now, the timestamp shows 6:12:06 a.m., and Nuttall says that this is the exact moment when he asked the question, and then Karen responded, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." So on cross-examination, defense attorney Alan Jackson brings up what Nuttall said when he testified in the previous trial, when he said that he remembered Karen Reed saying, "I hit him," but only saying it twice instead of 3 times. Now, look, this seems like a small detail, but the reason that I think the defense really wants to make a big point about this is because they are wanting to show the evolution of testimony in order to make everyone's story consistent. So here's what Nuttall said in the first trial.
As I was ventilating, I was able to ask, did anybody see anything? What happened? And there was one individual that replied several times, "I hit him, I hit him."
Now, in the last trial, Nuttall was very clear about this memory, and he repeated it a few times throughout his testimony.
I heard, "I hit him, I hit him."
That's what you believe at this point?
That's what I heard.
So during cross-examination, Jackson brings up a couple of things. One, he says that in the interview that Nuttall did with Proctor on February 8th, he told Proctor that he heard Karen say this to another female on the scene, but he said nothing about asking Karen a direct question and her answering directly to him saying this, which of course would have been a big thing to include. Now, the other thing that Jackson brings up, of course, is the difference in the memory of this being said twice or 3 times. And Jackson asks Nuttall if Brennan pointed out the discrepancy to him, and he says yes, that's something they discussed.
We did go over the testimony from last year, yes, sir.
Were there any issues that Mr. Brennan or anybody else in that meeting brought up concerning any of your testimony?
There was just a question of how many times the I hit him came up. It was 3 times.
Now, they go back and forth a bit about this, and Jackson pushes about Nuttall's memory and his recollection of things, and he asks if Nuttall's memory gets better with time.
But in this case, you're telling this jury that your memory is better now than it was a year ago when you testified about the exact same circumstance, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So they discuss Nuttall's memory a little bit here. Now, if you watched last year's trial, you may recall hearing Nuttall talk about removing a big puffy jacket from John O'Keefe. We know that this jacket doesn't exist, and it was a faulty memory. It was brought up last year and brought up again during cross-examination this year. They also talk about his statements to Trooper Proctor, including telling Proctor that Karen Reed was praying over John O'Keefe.
Did you tell Trooper Proctor on February 8th, while you were rendering aid, and at the time you heard the statement, Miss Reed was actually praying over John? Your words, praying over John.
I don't recall ever saying that.
So Jackson asks about this a little more, and they go back and forth about whether or not Nuttall just doesn't remember saying that, or if he's saying he may have said it, but he doesn't remember. But Nuttall says no, that's not something he said, and it didn't happen.
Don't believe I've ever said praying. That's really not something that I would have said. I didn't see it that day. It didn't happen. I don't remember ever saying prayed.
You didn't
in regards to this case ever.
You didn't see it that day, and it never happened.
Here's why this is important for the defense. I'm going to jump ahead just for a moment to day 2. Kerry Roberts takes the stand, and Jackson asks about this happening, and Kerry confirms that it did happen.
And then you went on to describe that Karen and Jen and I were standing outside, and she made us all start holding hands and starting to pray.
Yes.
I mean, the she being Karen Reed, correct?
Yes.
So Nuttall's original report with Proctor mentioned the praying, which he now says he didn't see and it didn't happen, and he didn't tell Proctor that. And here's Kerry saying it actually did happen. Then there's the thing with the coat that didn't exist, and now here's this memory of Karen Reed saying to him, "I hit him," 3 times. Jackson points out that Nuttall is now saying that the praying thing never happened, but that it somehow ended up in the report. But he remembers the "I hit him 3 times" thing happening, but that didn't end up in the report.
Again, I don't remember ever saying the words praying over him. I do distinctly remember I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
Which doesn't appear in that report, does it?
So the clear picture he's painting to the jury right now is this. The memories here can't be relied on completely, so the jury shouldn't consider them as concrete. The other point that the defense wants to make during this cross-examination is the time during the dash cam when Nuttall says that Karen Reed said this to him. Now, Jackson shows the dash cam video, and it's the same video the prosecution showed, except there's no timestamp on it. Jackson asked Nuttall about what's happening, having him identify where he is and where Flamati is on the video. He says Nuttall was very clear about his memory being that Flamati was kneeling down beside him, doing chest compressions when Karen Reed made the statement to him, "I hit him 3 times." So Jackson points out the time at which he says Flamati kneels down.
What did you see firefighter Flamati do just now?
I believe he just knelt down.
Okay. So at this point, he's kneeling for the first time, correct?
Yes, sir.
And he's about to provide chest compressions as your memory serves, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's go ahead and play it forward.
Jackson has the video played forward, and the entire rest of the clip, until John is put on the stretcher, is played. Now, Jackson points out that Karen never again approached them, so there would be no chance for this interaction that he says he remembered to have happened the way that he says he remembers it distinctly. Now, there's no timestamp on the video the defense showed, so I pulled that one up and the one that the prosecution showed and lined them up to play side by side to find out the timestamp on this all going on. So the timestamp from when Nuttall said to Brennan that Karen came over was almost 1 minute before the time that Nuttall is saying that Flamati actually knelt down for the first time. Jackson is wanting to show that his memory could not be clear on this if there's no time that Karen approached when they were both kneeling. And this line of questioning makes Brennan mad. When he gets back up for redirect, he shows his version of the video again, saying that the timestamp was removed by the defense and the clip started after the point where Nuttall had said the exchange happened. Now, he shows the first clip again, but he doesn't address Flamati not kneeling down. So when Jackson gets a chance to question Nuttall again, Nuttall says that, yeah, Flamati wasn't doing chest compressions or CPR at that time, but the other paramedic was doing them, Greg Kelly. So what will the jury take from this? There were multiple times that we were able to see cracks in Nuttall's memory, which isn't uncommon. And a juror can throw out an entire testimony if they think that the testimony isn't credible or reliable. So are these inconsistencies going to be enough to cause any of the jurors to question the story of what was actually said? We'll have to see. At the end of this testimony, the prosecution plays a clip from the ID docuseries that was recorded in June of 2024, where Karen Reed talks about whether or not she remembers certain things, or if she's been told so many things that it's changed her perception of what she actually remembers, including saying, "I hit him" or "Did I hit him?"
I also wondered, did I say could I have hit him? Or was it told to me that I said I hit him? And I knew I never could have said that, so the closest I must have said was, did I hit him? I know I said I hit him, but did I really say it as many times as law enforcement's claiming I said it?
The final witness of day 1 was Kerry Roberts, and she carried on into day 2. And we see a lot of the same tactic here. But this time, the defense is able to get a huge moment to come out as they're picking holes in this testimony. And for the first time, we hear that Kerry Roberts gave false testimony to the grand jury about a topic that has been one of the most highly contested since this case first blew up. We'll be right back after this. Week 1 of Karen Reed's second trial was very different than week 1 of her first trial, and there were a few fireworks, which we'll get to shortly. And there was also a witness that we haven't heard from before, John's mom, Peggy O'Keefe. Kerry Roberts and Mike Camerano also took the stand this week, and I want to talk about their testimonies shortly, especially because those 3 witnesses were closer to John, and their testimonies were much more personal. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the other first responders who testified this week. Daniel Whitley and Jason Becker from Canton Fire Department both took the stand this week. These are 2 of the first responders who came to 34 Fairview when Karen made the statements about taking her own life, and they made the call to have a Section 12 for her. These 2 witnesses testified about the same event and time frame, but told about what happened in very different ways. And I can't help but compare and contrast the way that they told things. Now let's start with Whitley. Daniel Whitley's testimony this time around was very similar to his testimony in the last trial. He knows Kerry Roberts, they're neighbors, and he says that he wouldn't consider what they have a friendship, but they're acquaintances. Now, Whitley testifies about an exchange that he had in the back of the ambulance with Karen Reed when he says that she was talking about what would happen if John didn't make it out of this. Here's how he said this happened.
She kept saying, I can't take care of these kids. I can't take care of these kids. They're not my kids, and they're not his kids. And I, at that point, I understood who Ambulance 1 had taken, because John was pretty well known in the town for taking on the care of his niece and nephew.
But when Jason Becker was asked about this, here's how he described it.
Yeah, she's worried about who would take care of the children if he was pronounced dead. She didn't think that she could take care of them on her own. She was worried about that.
These are two very different interpretations of what was said. Now, Becker testified about what he remembered from that day, and I'll be honest, it seemed like he just didn't want to be there. He wanted to give his testimony and get off the stand. It was as direct and to the point as possible, and he answered things as accurately as possible. He came across to me, personally, as extremely credible. Whitley, however, I don't know, his testimony gave me pause, and here's why. The way that he described things and the things that he said about Karen, it came across to me as just kind of bitter. He called her snarky, and even though he was there for a Section 12 because she made statements about ending her own life if John died, he called her behavior bizarre. Now, both of those statements were objected to and stricken from the record in both trials. And he said that he made a comment to Karen about how she had a support system. And he said that Karen commented to him that if he really knew Kerry Roberts, he wouldn't be saying that. He also said that Karen was giving the hospital a hard time and didn't want to give a urine sample, making it sound like she was just being difficult. But on cross-examination, David Unetti brought up Karen not wanting to give a urine sample because she wasn't allowed any privacy to use the bathroom because of the Section 12 hold. And it was that time of the month for her, and she didn't have any feminine products with her and didn't want to have to go through all of that in a little bathroom with people watching her. Now, David Unetti also brings up previous statements of Whitley's that have kind of changed or evolved over time. For example, he testified that Karen Reed said something about John O'Keefe being able to survive in the snow for many hours. But that's not something he mentioned in his initial reports or his grand jury testimony. Now, as far as Jason Becker, the only big hang-up with his testimony was both the prosecution and the defense really just picking apart Karen telling Becker about her last interaction with John and how it was some sort of argument. They pick apart the word choice, the interpretation of what was said, and what it could mean. Now, the prosecution wants the jury to interpret this as the last interaction being an argument, as in they were in person arguing, since that's the theory that they have presented about what happened when Karen was dropping John off at Fairview Road. The defense wants the jury to interpret this as being through text and voicemails, not in person, pointing out that Karen held up her phone to try to show Becker as she was talking about their fight and trying to show him missed calls. It'll be up to the jury to determine how they interpret it. Now, the arguing between John and Karen has been brought up before, and this week the jury heard texts between the couple from throughout the day leading up to their meetup at McCarthy's that night. Trooper Garino took the stand to read the text exchange, and this time they showed the full exchange instead of a few cherry-picked texts, which painted a fuller picture for the jury. Now, there was an argument in the morning where Karen said that John really hurt her. And you can tell that she wants to talk about it, and she wants to get it worked out or squashed or just figure out what's next. And John isn't ready to address it yet. So he ignores her calls. He tells her that he's with the kids and his dad, and he can't talk yet. So they go back and forth, and then they finally start talking about plans for that night and about meeting up. John eventually tells Karen to come there because he's going to rely on her for a ride, and he wants her to stay with him for the weekend. Now, he gets upset that she has a plumber come fix her hot water heater because he says that he and his dad could have done it. And he makes a comment about how he hopes that the plumber is hot. and about him coming over at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. I was curious, so I asked during the live stream if these were normal relationship issues or if it was something bigger. And we did a poll on whether or not any of the chatters have had text exchanges like this. Now, 24% said that they have not, and the rest said that they have either had them with an ex or a current spouse or both. Now, whatever arguments they had that morning, we know that they worked out whatever it was by the time that Karen showed up at McCarthy's, because we see how affectionate they were when she arrived. And maybe that push and pull is normal for them as a couple. And maybe alcohol doesn't help. In the text from that afternoon, John says that he just sobered up an hour ago, and they're talking about going out again. Now, Karen was drinking that night also, and clips are played from various interviews for the jury where she's talking about it. In one clip, she said that her drinks at the bar were very weak and tasted like there was no alcohol, so that's why she added the shots. So she said the number of drinks that the prosecutors are counting is really about maybe half of that, and she says that there were some drinks that she didn't even touch. But more importantly, the jury hears Karen in those clips admit that she was buzzed and she shouldn't have been driving. In one of them, she describes wondering, after she found John, if she could have hit him or clipped him. Now, while Karen admits to being buzzed, there's testimony about her saying that she was so drunk that she doesn't remember some of the night before. And the amount of alcohol that Karen actually consumed is going to still be up for debate by both sides for a few reasons. Dr. Gary Fowler testified this week. Now, he works in the lab at Good Samaritan Hospital, so he came to testify about the blood draw and alcohol testing that they did while Karen was there. It resulted in a reading of 93 milligrams per deciliter. So to convert that to blood alcohol level, you divide by 1,000. So that means that the blood alcohol level would have been 0.093%. Now, for reference, in Massachusetts, the max legal level for driving is 0.08%. But here's why the defense argued against this reading. Now, there are two ways to test the alcohol levels in the blood. One way is whole blood tests, and the other is plasma or serum tests. And the results of each are not the same, even if they're taken from the same person and the same sample. While whole blood test is just like it sounds, it's the whole sample of your blood, exactly as it is when it comes out of your body. The plasma and serum tests are different. For those, the blood sample tube is put into a device that spins it, which separates the blood cells and the plasma. Picture like oil and vinegar dressing. You know how the oil floats to the top of the vinegar? So it's kind of like that. And the part that they test is that part up on top. So forensic labs use the whole blood testing, and the hospital uses the serum test. But the defense wanted to make the point that the serum tests give higher or more elevated results than the whole blood test. And it's the whole blood tests that are used in forensic labs. So those are the ones that they usually just rely on for court. Basically, the defense wants the jury to know that the way that the hospital did the testing may make it look like Karen was more intoxicated than she really was. Now let's talk about some of the testimony that was the most emotional of the week. It's no secret that John O'Keefe was a great man. Sure, he wasn't perfect, but anyone who has had their texts read out loud in court for the world to hear, anyone would for sure have some that they cringed when they heard. That's normal. That's human. But John O'Keefe was a good person, and his life being lost is tragic and heartbreaking. The testimony we heard this week from his good friend, Mike Camerano, Kerry Roberts, and John's mom, Peggy O'Keefe, was full of emotion, and the jury, along with everyone watching, was able to feel that. Mike Camerano looked really upset as he took the stand. The weight of the loss is obviously heavy on his shoulders. He described his friendship with John and how their kids were friends too. John's niece and Mike's daughter had both just been accepted into Bishop Finn High School, and they were both so proud. He talked about meeting up with John that night to go to McCarthy's, and their friend Kurt Roberts, who is Kerry Roberts' husband, also met them out briefly. Now, Kerry said that Kurt got back home around 10 or 10:30 and they went to bed. Mike says that he left early because his son had a hockey accident, so he went to go get him, and then he went home and went to bed. Now, the next morning, Karen begins making phone calls, calling Mike and Mike's wife and Kerry Roberts. Mike said he was panicked. And he knew that John's niece was alone, so he drove to get her from the house. He becomes emotional as he describes that moment. After a while, Mike said that Paul, John's brother, called and told him what happened, so he drove John's niece home to be with their family.
Ask Madeline and Kaylee if I'd say, Madeline, we come for the ride. I don't say anything to Kaylee, and we get in the car, and I start heading back to John's house.
And you didn't say anything to Kaylee?
No, I didn't. I just said everything will be all right. She had a feeling.
Why do you say that?
She didn't want to go home.
Mike tells the jury that he didn't really know about arguments between John and Karen, though John would sometimes get mad if Karen bought expensive things for the kids, and Karen didn't want John being around other women. He says the two of them did everything together, and he spent time with both of them, and he trusted both of them with his own children. Now, another emotional testimony was from John's mom, Peggy O'Keefe. Brennan began by asking her a few questions about their family history and where they lived. And after she made a couple of jokes about how long she's been married, for too long, is what she said, the brief moment of levity diminished, and Mrs. O'Keefe became tearful on the stand as she talked about the loss of her daughter, then her son-in-law, and then John.
My daughter, Kristen, had a tumor, a cancerous tumor, that she had for 5 months. And she died in November of 13. She had 2 children. And then 2 months after she passed, her husband passed from a heart attack. And then you all know about John. And then my son Paul is over there.
Mrs. O'Keefe talked about John and what kind of person he was.
He was wonderful with the kids. He took care of them and did everything for them. Take them places on vacations and everything. He was their number one when they called him JJ.
Brennan shows a picture of John to Mrs. O'Keefe for identification, and she says, "That's my son." Now, the picture is then displayed for the jury, and John is smiling, the kind of genuine smile that extends to your eyes and the rest of your face. And his eyes are bright. He's strikingly handsome. Mrs. O'Keefe says that she thinks that the picture was taken at some sort of fair or amusement park when he had taken the kids there. She's asked about Kerry Roberts, and Mrs. O'Keefe explains that they've known her for a long time. She and John actually went to junior prom together. It was Kerry who called Mrs. O'Keefe when they found John, and they each give their recollection of this call on the stand.
I called Mrs. O'Keefe and told her John had been in an accident.
Yeah, she said John was found in a snowbank, and I didn't understand, which I said, "What do you mean found in a snowbank?" She said, "They found him in the snow. They don't know what happened." She says he's brought up to the Good Samaritan Hospital.
And she screamed, "I can't do this again."
Kerry went to pick up the O'Keefes and drove them to the hospital. On the way there, Karen called, and Mrs. O'Keefe asked her what happened.
I asked her what happened, and she said, we went to a party. I left him there. I said, "You just left him there?" She said, "Yes, I just left him there."
And Mr. O'Keefe said, "All right, that's enough. She's been through enough." Then we hung up with her. I said, "We're on our way to the hospital."
When they arrived at the hospital, Mrs. O'Keefe said that she saw Karen.
So we started walking down the corridor, and as I'm walking down, I hear Karen Reed yell, "Peg, is he dead? Is he dead, Peg? Peg, is he dead?"
And I just kept walking, and then I asked, I don't know who it was, a nurse or
a worker at the hospital, and I said, "What is she doing here?" And she says, "Oh, she's being psych evaluated."
The mother in me finds this testimony heart-wrenching. The analytical part of me wants to know why someone in the hospital would give out personal information about another patient. We'll be right back after this. Now, Mrs. O'Keefe says that she didn't speak to Karen. She was taken down to see John, and she described his eyes being bruised and closed and said it wasn't a good scene. Kerry was taken in to see him shortly after, and she described John as having both eyes filled with blood, looking like raccoon eyes. She said this was different than when she saw him on the lawn at Fairview when only one eye was swollen. Before they left, Kerry said that she removed the blue rubber bracelet from John O'Keefe that was made when his sister passed. She gave it to Mrs. O'Keefe, who she said still wears it to this day. Now, the O'Keefes went back to John's house after that, both of his parents and his brother Paul. John's niece and nephew were both brought home at separate times, and Mrs. O'Keefe said that there was a knock on the door. It was Karen and her father and brother, and they asked if they could come inside. Mrs. O'Keefe said that she was trying to calm John's nephew Patrick because he was out of control, yelling, and Karen asked to go upstairs and get some of her things.
And then they came in, and then he said, "Do you mind if we go upstairs and get a couple of her things?" Which I never should have let them go up there, but at the time, I just couldn't think straight, and I really didn't have anybody else to help me keep them down in the kitchen. So I don't know what they got up there, what they did up there.
Mrs. O'Keefe said that they were up there for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but she didn't see them come back down because she was busy with the kids. Brennan asked if Mrs. O'Keefe had any interaction with Karen, and she said no. He asked if she accused her of anything or leaned over a kitchen island and said, "I think he looks like he got hit by a car." Mrs. O'Keefe said she doesn't remember talking to her that morning. Now, defense attorney Alan Jackson offers his condolences to Mrs. O'Keefe and says he has no questions. John's mother leaves the stand with the final line of questioning hanging in the air about her accusing Karen of anything or leaning over and saying it looks like John got hit by a car. So in this moment, Hank Brennan asked to admit 2 clips into evidence. The first is Karen Reed in an interview saying that she felt uncomfortable when she was at the house. And she told her dad to come upstairs to the master bedroom, where she told him, "I think we need to leave because I think that John's mom thinks I did something to John." The defense has no objection to this coming in. It kind of gives the jury an explanation of why Karen wanted to leave instead of staying there with John's family. But the other clip, the defense objects to. Here's that clip.
And his mother leans over the kitchen island and says to me, "I think he looks like he got hit by a car. He looks like he got hit by a car."
So here's Brennan's argument on this. He says this clip shows consciousness of guilt. He says that Karen is making what he says is a false statement to try to excuse her conduct of removing evidence of a crime from the scene. But here's my problem with this. First of all, this isn't a crime scene. Second of all, it was her car, so of course she left in her car. But also, the argument that this is showing consciousness of guilt because she's trying to make an excuse for why she left, that part just doesn't make sense to me. Brennan is basically saying that Karen shouldn't have felt unwelcome there, and that the only reason that she did is because of her own guilt. But let's think about that. In an interview with CBS Boston, John's brother Paul said that the morning that they were all at John's after leaving the hospital, that his mom asked him if he thought that Karen had something to do with this. He said that they put the pieces together themselves that day before ever talking to any investigator. So, based on what they're saying, plus the frustration from Mrs. O'Keefe about when she asked why Karen just left John at the party and then asking what she's doing at the hospital, but then not talking to her. It sounds like Mrs. O'Keefe was suspicious of Karen Reed from pretty early on. And Jackson argues that this clip has nothing to do with consciousness of guilt, and he calls that argument baffling and points out that this clip is being used to vilify Karen. And I think he's right, and here's why I agree with him. Mrs. O'Keefe was not on the witness list on March 12th. Paul and Aaron both were, but not Mrs. O'Keefe. That documentary with that clip aired on March 17th, and within 2 days, by March 19th, Brennan had added Mrs. O'Keefe to the witness list. He then made a motion to request that footage, and in that motion, he writes that Karen, quote-unquote, mocks Mrs. O'Keefe's opinion that John looked like he had been hit by a car. Now, he doesn't at that point say that Karen is falsifying this exchange, only that she is mocking Mrs. O'Keefe's opinion. Now, by the time the trial has started, he is now saying that she just made the whole thing up. Now, Jackson says that Brennan put a very sympathetic witness up and now wants to show this clip to make Karen look bad to the jury. It's far more prejudicial than probative and has no evidentiary value. Now, Judge Canoni says that she will consider the arguments and give the ruling in the morning. So the next day, at the start of the day, to my surprise, she says she'll allow it. And she gives no reason as to why or how it qualifies as admissible evidence. Now, this shocked me, and I'm not an attorney, but I've picked up some pretty good understanding of certain legal parameters by covering trials for this amount of time. But there are obviously still a lot of things in the legal field that I don't understand fully, so this ruling was one of them, and I wanted to check with some attorneys, thinking maybe they could explain why this ruling was made. I first checked to see what attorney Emily D. Baker said about it, thinking, well, she's a former prosecutor, so she'll be able to explain why it was admitted. But she said the same thing I did, that this didn't have evidentiary value and it's going to be a big problem. Now, the thing about the law, it's open for interpretation and application by a judge. So there will be some rulings that people agree with and some they don't. And this is just one that I don't agree with. But it was allowed in and played for the jury. This isn't the only example of Brennan using emotions to sway the jury, though. In another completely insensitive and, in my opinion, uncalled for moments, Brennan asked to show Kerry Roberts a picture of John O'Keefe from when he was in the hospital, in really bad shape. He walks over and hands her the picture, and she begins to sob.
You recognize it?
Yes, I do.
Is that how John looked?
Yes, he did.
I'd ask that the camera not film that, please.
I'd like to mark this as an exhibit. I will not publish it.
This part infuriated me. It was completely unnecessary and only for the use of using the witness's pain to get an emotional reaction for the jury. I hated it, and it made me even angrier toward Brennan. This is now twice that he has used emotional manipulation and exploited the pain of witnesses to get a win. Kerry's testimony was emotional during this part, and during the last trial, she became emotional as well. Things were different this time around, though, because the last time, there was no cross-examination of Kerry and no fireworks. But this time, things have changed, and there are a few holes that the defense poked. For example, Kerry described the cracked taillight and recalls Karen pointing it out that morning. Now, in the last trial, Kerry described the taillight as being cracked with a little black hole. And in this trial, she describes it as having a piece missing. Now, Brennan shows Kerry the picture of Karen's SUV when it was in the Sallyport. This was a few days later. This is the one with the huge part of the taillight missing, pretty much the entire right side. And Brennan asks Kerry if that's an accurate depiction. Now, although this is nothing like anything she has described previously about what she saw, she agrees that it's accurate. Kerry walks through the story again about getting to Fairview Road, about Karen seeing John before they did, and how she told Jen McCabe that Karen is crazy when she got out of the car and ran toward John. She describes the scene, saying that John's right eye was huge, but his left eye was fine, and how she had blankets in her car that they wrapped around John's head. She said she gave chest compressions, and she says that at some point, Jen McCabe took over doing them, which is something I don't remember hearing before. And then EMTs arrived, and Karen ran around screaming, "Is he dead? And did I hit him?" She says that she walked over after they moved John and grabbed the blankets and his phone, which was laying on the ground under where he had been, and she put it in her pocket and then later handed it off to a first responder. In the last trial, she didn't remember which one, and she didn't name one on this trial either. Now, Brennan plays dash cam footage, a lot of it, and he pauses every so often to ask about what's on screen. And actually, quite often, there's nothing and nobody on screen. Now, there was some confusion about why he did this, but I compared the times that he stopped the video to my master timeline, and I think that the reason that he stopped at those specific spots is because those were important to what was happening around him. Now, for example, He stopped at the times when John's phone started and stopped registering steps, which I think was to demonstrate that it was registering steps at the time that Kerry was moving around, basically just trying to show that she still had the phone in her pocket. Also, he stopped at the time that the Google search was made in the morning, though there was nobody on screen, because at that time they were apparently supposed to be in a different cruiser out of view of the camera. Now, some of the biggest moments of week 1 happened during Kerry's cross-examination. We hear that Kerry and Jen McCabe became good friends after John's death, and Kerry admits to having talked to the DA's office about maybe 50 times. Now, that's a lot. Oh, also, she brings up harassment, though there is an objection, and that's quickly sustained. I think they're trying to keep that door closed this time around. Now, the defense goes over some things that have changed or some holes in Kerry's testimony and previous statements. Like, for example, her saying that they checked the back of Karen's taillight when they got to John's, but the videos show that they didn't. And the video of them leaving is missing, so she assumes that it was at that time instead. Also, they address Kerry going to Lank's house the next day, and certain parts of her testimony and statements that have changed here and there. But there were two main moments that kind of had social media on fire. One is from attorney Alan Jackson walking Kerry through all 6 of her interactions with police. Now, during the first, while they were on scene, Kerry doesn't mention anything at all about the taillight, or more importantly, she didn't say anything about Karen Reed calling her and saying John is dead first thing in the morning. Even when she called the non-emergency line, she said that Karen had taken John to some sort of blizzard party, and she repeated the other things that Karen had said, but she never said anything about that. And then didn't say anything about it to officers on scene. And then when law enforcement came and talked to her that night, again, she didn't say anything about Karen calling her at 5 a.m. saying John is dead. But after that, Jen McCabe and Kerry got close. And every single other interaction with police or testimony of some kind seemed to have Jen McCabe attached to it in some way. And only then, at that time, did Kerry now have the part of the story where Karen called her saying John was dead. Kerry said that she didn't mention it before because she just was in shock. Now, the interview that was done on February 1st was done while Kerry was literally at Jen McCabe's house, and it was done after she and Jen had sat down together and put together a timeline of everything. Jackson asked if she believed that that would influence her testimony or not. He also asked about Jen McCabe texting the group chat while police are there talking to Kerry. Jen said to the group chat, she's telling them everything. Now, it's also while she's at Jen's house that Kerry calls Proctor to talk to him. And she was also with Jen when she met with law enforcement the 4th time when she turned over her phone. And then when she testified at the grand jury, Jen McCabe was also with her on that day, right before she went on the stand. Kerry said that Jen texted her this very morning to wish her good luck. So Jackson really wants to point out that the whole thing about the phone call and Karen saying that John was dead first thing in the morning, that didn't come up until after Jen McCabe entered the picture, and he wanted the jury to see that this timeline and these memories had Jen's influence all over them. But the biggest moment came when Jackson brought up Kerry's grand jury testimony, and it's at that point that we hear for the first time that Kerry Roberts gave false information to the grand jury, because when Adam Lally asked what Kerry heard Karen asked Jen when they were by the police cruiser, she answered. And Jackson reads the transcript.
You stated, quote, at one point she asked her to Google hypothermia and how long Google hypothermia. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
I mean, this is a really big deal. Kerry says she misunderstood. She says that when Lally asked what she heard, she just went on the timeline and what she had done with Jen. And she answered based on what Jen told her, not on what she heard.
What you told the grand jurors was not true. You never heard her, my client, ask anyone to Google anything, did you?
I did not.
And yet, that's what you testified to under oath, under penalty of perjury, in front of the grand jury, didn't you?
I did.
And the reason you did that, the reason that you said that false statement, was because someone told you to say it, correct?
Object.
Is that, I'm going to let her answer that.
Nobody told me to say it. I knew it happened at that time,
How did you
which
know
is
it
why I
happened?
said it.
How did you know it happened, Ms. Roberts, if no one told you it happened?
Because we wrote a timeline. We already spoke about
So
that.
the timeline that Jennifer McCabe helped you with, that influenced your testimony in front of the grand jury, correct? Obviously.
I was telling what happened in the back of the cruiser.
So here's what this means. The grand jury used testimony from these witnesses to decide whether or not there was enough evidence to indict Karen Reed for the death of John O'Keefe. Jen McCabe has said that she Googled how long to die in the cold in the morning because Karen asked her to, and that the Celebrite report that said that she Googled it at 2:27 a.m. is wrong. Now somehow, even though this supposedly happened in a police cruiser, there's no audio of it from the dash cam. And now, Kerry Roberts is admitting that she didn't hear this being said, which means the only witness to Jen McCabe being asked to search that is now Jen McCabe herself. And she put it on this timeline and told Kerry about it, who then relayed it to the grand jury as her own observation. Now that was a big moment for the defense, and probably the biggest moment of week one. The week ended with a jury view, where the jurors got to take a bus to 34 Fairview and look at the yard and Karen's SUV out in the front. Now, before they went, each side got to tell the jurors what they wanted them to focus on or pay attention to. The prosecution asked the jurors to pay attention to the street and the front yard and to note the berm by the road. Also, Brennan said for them to make note of the height of the bumper and the taillight, and the part of the car on the top that kind of protrudes out. The defense wanted the jurors to pay attention to the second floor window on the house and how close it is to the yard. Presumably this is because they have brought up that Brian and Nicole Albert never came outside when they heard what was happening, and they want the jury to see how close that window actually is to where the commotion was. The defense also wanted the jurors to note the distance to the doors and to the driveway, and to take note of the multiple front doors. Now, the judge instructed the jury that the purpose of this is to help them better understand the area and the car and to see it all in person, and that they will use that when they're making their conclusions. In the footage from the viewing, there was something interesting that was photographed. There was a large rock in the front yard with hand painting on it that read Albert. Now, it hasn't been there before. It's never shown up in any picture. I thought it was kind of strange, especially since the Alberts don't live there anymore. Now, locals began posting pictures on social media the next day, making note that that rock that mysteriously showed up for the jury view is now gone. So, where did it come from? Who put it there and why? And where did it go after? These are all questions that I have, and I don't know if we'll get answers or not. And finally, there was an explosive affidavit filed at the end of the week. Now, this one claims that an agent of the Commonwealth, a witness who has been giving them information in the cases against Karen Reed and against Aiden Carney, has been in regular communication with ADA Adam Lally. The sworn affidavit says that this person, Kate Peter, a longtime enemy of Aiden Carney, who has ongoing litigation against her, met with ADA Lally prior to deliberations in the last trial, and that Lally relayed to her that he knows the foreperson, who is a retired police officer, and he is guaranteeing a mistrial. Peter then apparently relayed this to the person in the affidavit. It also goes on to say that Peter is being paid $1,500 a month via Cash App for her assistance in the prosecution of Karen Reed and Aiden Carney, and that she has also had multiple conversations and meetings with prosecutor Hank Brennan, though now they only communicate through a third party. It also alleges that Peter asked this person to go stalk Karen Reed in her hotel, and that Peter admitted to creating the image of Karen Reed and Alan Jackson where it looked like they were embracing. And that was all an attempt to spread it online, which worked. That story got picked up by national news. It also says that Jen McCabe bought Peter a brand new sectional couch as compensation for her assistance, and that she's doing everything she can to make sure that Turtle Boy isn't allowed in the courtroom for the second trial. And it also said that Jen McCabe said unless Turtle Boy's in jail, she won't testify this time. Among other things. I mean, this affidavit says a lot. Every day, I think this trial can't get any wilder. And every day, I eat my own words, realizing I was wrong. So that's it for week 1, at least the highlights. Week 2 is expected to start out with a bang. The prosecution is still pushing for ARCA to come deliver all of their communications with the defense, and the judge has issued an order for it. The jury has a half day on Monday, so the ARCA experts will be coming in Monday afternoon to handle all of this, and the judge will decide what, if anything, happens here. Also, news broke this week that Canton Police Chief Rafferty will be retiring at the end of her term, which some Canton residents have expressed approval of, and some have shown some mistrust, wondering about the timing. There seems to be a cloud of suspicion over everything in Canton these days. And finally, this week the Supreme Court of the United States held the conference that will decide if they take on Karen's case or not, so we're all waiting for that decision to be published. It was a big week, but the first week is now behind us, and the world is watching to see what week 2 brings up next. My name is Brandy Churchwell, creator of 13th Juror Podcast. If you're enjoying it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share this episode with your friends. For more information, photos, and episode guides, visit our website at 13thjurorpodcast.com.